The herringbone weave that is so consistent throughout the main body of the shroud seemed misaligned, off-axis.
Our theory is that there's a mixture of 16th century cloth and 1st century cloth, and the data that we're finding on the cloth matches that theory.
Benford and Marino argue that carbon dating is wrong because the section from where the samples were taken had been contaminated with fibers from a later date. According to this theory, cotton from the 16th century was invisibly woven into the linen fibers of the shroud. A fixer was applied to the patched area, and the repair was expertly dyed so that it would be invisible to the naked eye. It is a craft they contend was called French reweaving.
When you do this type of French reweaving, you're not just stitching two pieces of material together, and that would give you all of one and all of the other. It's more like this. The ends are unraveled in the main cloth. The ends are unraveled in the patch. They are spliced together, and the threads are connected and interwoven, so you see literally an interweaving such that you have old and new on both sides of the equation.
I'm skeptical when I'm listening to this, but they had taken photographs that were available of the samples taken for the carbon dating, and they had submitted these to several textile experts who didn't know they were looking at a photograph from the shroud, and each of these textile experts, independent of each other, said, you know, this looks rewoven. The samples taken for radiocarbon dating were cut from one corner of the shroud, adjacent to a seam. It was effectively an area that was damaged by someone cutting a piece out of it, possibly to sell as relic, so it needed to be repaired.
So when the C14 samples were taken, you're going to have a lot of end-mixing on both sides. So unless you actually took one thread and did them individually, you wouldn't get a 1st century or a 16th century. You get, you know, guess what? Something around 12 to 1400.
Benford went looking for statistical anomalies in the carbon dating results that would confirm a mixture of old and new threads. What she discovered was an incredible pattern that could not be explained away as coincidence.
If you look at their unpublished data now, Arizona had some of the oldest dates at 1238 and the youngest at 1430. And you think, were they really 200 years off in their lab? Well, perhaps it's because of material they took from both of their different sides. Now, we don't know that for sure, and they haven't confirmed that. But that's interesting. Oxford is the next oldest, and they're the closest to this side with the most main 1st century material. Zurich is in the middle, and guess what? They have the middle amount, and they have the middle date.
In 2000, Benford and Marino presented a paper in Orvieto, Italy, detailing their theory that medieval cotton had been introduced into the damaged corner of the shroud. Not surprisingly, it was immediately dismissed by the scientific community. One scientist in particular was outraged.
One of the things Ray had a problem with was the fact these weren't scientists, and he didn't take them very seriously.
I think he lumped us in with the lunatic fringe at that time, and probably for many times beyond that.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw.
I got a call from Ray, and he goes, what the hell is this? This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes. And I said, well, Ray, go for it.
But when Ray Rogers went into his lab, he was shocked by what he found. In his opinion, Sue Benford and Joe Marino were right. In 1988, science declared that it was impossible for the Shroud of Turin to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It was only 700 years old. Sue Benford and Joe Marino offered the first real challenge to the carbon dating results. They believed that they had proved the carbon dating wrong because the section from where the samples were taken had been tainted with 16th century cotton fibers. Chemist Ray Rogers, an original STIRP member, thought the Benford-Marino theory was wildly implausible.
He just didn't buy it. He said, that's nonsense. It can't be true. He was the gunfighter of Sturp. He was one of those guys that if he didn't like what you were saying, he'd have pulled out his six-shooter and fired off six before he had a chance to take a breath. He was not very tolerant, especially of people doing bad science.
It sounds far-fetched. I mean, it does sound extremely convenient. You know, I didn't believe it myself when I came up with it.
Rogers was in a unique position to confirm or dismiss Benford and Marino's theory.
Ray had in his possession, from 1978, the tape samples lifted from the surface of the shroud. But remember, those were not big fibers. Those were fibrils taken from the surface. He also had some samples that were taken from the shroud by Professor Reyes, who took samples in 1973 from a corner that was immediately adjacent to the area taken for carbon dating.
What few realized was that Ray Rogers was in a race against time. He was losing a long battle with cancer. His old friend, Barry Schwartz, recorded this interview to ensure Ray could recount in his own words what he did next.
So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
No one was more shocked than Rogers himself. His initial observation seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's hypothesis. But he knew to be absolutely certain he needed to examine the threads that were carbon dated.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything.
The carbon dating process destroys the sample as part of the dating procedure. But all the labs involved in 1988 had held on to a small sample as a reserve.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye.
Rogers also returned to Sturp's 1978 experiments to see if there was anything the carbon dating labs had overlooked.
And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area around the Ross sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample.
Had somebody paid attention to my photographs of 78 and other data that we gathered, they would have chosen a different area.
My conclusion is that that area was manipulated. It was done by somebody with great skill and different materials than were used to make the shroud.
In 2005, just 5 weeks before losing his battle with cancer, Rogers published the last paper of his distinguished career. He did not call into question the science of the carbon dating labs. In fact, he believed they were accurate, but only for the damaged section of the shroud. In his opinion, the results told us nothing about the true age of the main body of the shroud.